It's Sunday, September 12. If you've been listening to or watching my video messages for any length of time now, you might have noticed that a common theme in my messages has been how God's grace always takes priority in our lives. So a relationship with God is built not so much on our decision, our work, our effort, but it's something that rests on the work of God primarily and ultimately. It's always a response to the work of God that makes a relationship real in our lives. God takes the initiative. We see that so often in the Bible. It's really the main theme of the entire Bible, how God takes the initiative of grace, and we, by His grace, gratefully acknowledge it and respond to it and experience the joy of a relationship with God as a result of it. We're going to see that again this morning as we reflect on an old, familiar story from the Gospel. Many of us learned the story of Zacchaeus when we were children. Perhaps we sang that song about the wee little man Zacchaeus who climbed up into the sycamore tree. It's a story that has found its way in many, many children's Bibles and Sunday school lessons. And no matter how old we get, there's something about this story that draws us in and really shows the beauty of what a relationship with Jesus Christ is all about. I'm going to read the words recorded in Luke chapter 19, verses 1 through 10, reading them from the New Living Translation this morning, and I'll explain why I've chosen that translation in a little while. But let's hear these words. Jesus entered Jericho and made his way through the town. There was a man there named Zacchaeus. He was the chief tax collector in the region, and he had become very rich. He tried to get a look at Jesus, but he was too short to see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree beside the road, for Jesus was going to pass that way. When Jesus came by, he looked up at Zacchaeus and called him by name. "Zacchaeus," he said, "quick, come down. I must be a guest in your home today." Zacchaeus quickly climbed down and took Jesus to his house in great excitement and joy. But the people were displeased. "He has gone to be the guest of a notorious sinner," they grumbled. Meanwhile, Zacchaeus stood before the Lord and said, "I will give half my wealth to the poor, Lord, and if I have cheated people on their taxes, I will give them back 4 times as much." Jesus responded, "Salvation has come to this home today, for this man has shown himself to be a true son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and save those who are lost." There's something in this story that reminds us of the interplay between guilt and grace. Another one of the main themes that we find everywhere in the Bible, guilt and grace. How we sin and are aware of that sin, and yet how God meets us in all our brokenness and rebellion with grace. We certainly see that in this story. Zacchaeus undoubtedly felt the weight of guilt on a daily and nightly basis. He was, as the reading I just indicated, a notorious sinner in the eyes of those who knew him. Tax collectors, of course, were not people that were appreciated in the time of Jesus. They were children of Israel, Jewish people who longed for the fulfillment of all God's promises, the restoration of the kingdom of Israel. That's what every God-fearing Jew anticipated. But here was Zacchaeus, who, like other tax collectors, worked for the evil empire, the Romans. And not only did they invest in those who were military occupiers of God's chosen land, who oppressed the people, they more often than not took more money than they should have, which is why, as we read in this story, Zacchaeus, like many tax collectors, was wealthy. It was probably the only consolation they had in life, because everywhere they went, they must have been despised and shamed and ridiculed by people. Zacchaeus must have led a very lonely life. And notice that he's identified here as a chief tax collector. This suggests that Zacchaeus has been working in the system of collecting taxes for quite some time. He has worked his way up the corporate ladder, we might say. Tax collection was like organized crime, as we sometimes refer to things in our modern contemporary setting. Zacchaeus was heavily invested in something that we would probably refer to today as the mob. He's a kingpin in this organized system. As someone has put it, he's a godfather in the toll-maker mafia. Now that's something important to know about him. He has climbed his way up into this system. Apparently Zacchaeus was fond of climbing things, as we see in this story where he climbed into that tree. Notice too that there's something very ironic about his name, Zacchaeus. Many times in the Bible, we encounter people whose names really are significant because they're descriptive of their character, or they may foreshadow something that would happen later in their life. Think of Jacob, for instance, Jacob the heel grasper, literally what that name means, euphemistically referring to someone who is a deceiver, a con artist. Certainly Jacob lived out that identity as he struggled with his brother Esau to be the first one born, grabbing his heel, hoping to pull him back. Names are significant in the Bible, and the name of Zacchaeus has a particular irony. Zacchaeus means righteous. Nobody would have thought of Zacchaeus as being a righteous man. That's what's so ironic about it. He's not at all righteous and pure, a paragon of virtue. He's a little scoundrel, a small-time crook. And Zacchaeus knew this. He knew exactly where he stood in the community. He knew that he didn't measure up according to the standards of virtue. He didn't measure up in every way, literally and spiritually. Nobody looked up to him. And so he lived a very lonely life, a very tragic life, facing every day a barrage of scorn and criticism. And a lot of this, of course, is due to his own choices. We can't just make him out to be a helpless victim. He undoubtedly had some choice in being what he was. And yet you can't help but feel a little sorrow and compassion for little Zacchaeus and the lonely, tragic life that he lived. His life was probably, as far as he understood it, never going to change. He would always be what he has always been, an outsider, broken and despised, feeling the weight of guilt. Now, we might not like to think of it this way, but Zacchaeus is a lot like us. Not in the sense that we face that same constant barrage of criticism, scorn, or ridicule that he probably did. But as far as our measuring up to standards of virtue and the expectations that God has for us to live as holy people, we fall short, as Zacchaeus did, short. Paul puts it that way exactly when he talks about in his letter to the Romans how all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. We don't measure up. None of us does. Not in the sight of God. And there's a very interesting thing in the story that even gets at this, how Zacchaeus tried to climb a tree, not only so that he could get a look at Jesus as he passed by, but it was a way of hiding, of covering up his guilt, of being what he hoped would be a spectator, hidden in the tree. This is why I read from the New Living Translation. A lot of translations indicate that Zacchaeus climbed up into a sycamore tree, but it's literally a sycamore fig tree. That's significant because it brings us back to the very opening chapters of the Bible. You know the story of Adam and Eve. And as soon as they sinned, they felt this weight of guilt that we all experience. They felt ashamed. For the first time, they saw themselves in a way that was not at all in line with the way God wanted any of us to see ourselves, to see each other. What did they do? They covered their shame and their nakedness with what? Fig leaves. Fig leaves. So you see a connection here in the story of Zacchaeus to the sin of Adam and Eve, to our own sin, and how we often also try to cover it up, to hide. We're ashamed of it, and we want to get rid of that burden as we stand in the presence of a God who is purely righteous. Who is Zacchaeus? He's everyone. everyone who tries to hide. We are righteous. We bear that same name in a way. The Bible talks about how, as those who are living in a relationship with Jesus Christ, we are made righteous, and yet we constantly fall short of that name, that calling, that identity. Notice that Jesus does not see Zacchaeus primarily, certainly not exclusively, in his guilt. But he speaks out to him, calling him by name with words of love, invitation, and grace. Jesus calls out to him, addressing him by name, the righteous one. And he says to him, Zacchaeus, come down from that tree, come out of your hiding. I must come to your house today. I love the way there's an insistence captured in those words. Jesus must go to this man's house. It speaks of how the Lord is so interested, so eager in having a relationship, even with us when we feel so lost and broken and ashamed. It's really the story of the gospel. It brings us back to the book of Genesis again. No sooner do Adam and Eve sin and hide themselves, and what do we read? God calls out to them. He goes looking for them in their cowering, in their shame. He calls their names, not with words of judgment, but with words of grace, with a broken heart that wants to see a relationship that has been ripped apart, rebuilt, and restored. This is the voice that God speaks to us ultimately in the voice of Jesus Christ, who calls us by name and invites us to enjoy the beauty of a relationship with him. It's not a voice of judgment, of condemnation, but a voice of love. A voice that invites us to come down and come out from our hiding places and to be rid of the shame and guilt that can so paralyze us at times and experience the joy and the freedom of knowing him. Do you feel sometimes that God could never love you, that God is angry with you, that if you were in the presence of Jesus, if you could just picture that, imagine what that might be like, do you think that his words spoken to you would be words of condemnation, of disapproval? Do you think that he can never accept you because you have wandered too far from him or done things that are just unforgivable? Are you hiding from God, running from God? He's calling out to you. I think of an illustration from a preacher decades ago. I found this in an old book. And he talked about how there was a woman in his congregation who was about to be evicted because she could no longer pay the rent. When he heard about that, he went to her, knocking on her door. Nobody ever answered the door, but he was persistent. He went a number of times, knocking on the door. The woman was inside, but she was so afraid to answer the door because she thought it was the landlord who was coming to evict her. She didn't know that it was her pastor who was coming to help her. And isn't it the case that so often we also think that when we hear the knock on the door to our heart, we don't open the door, we don't answer it because we think God is going to judge and condemn us when he's really coming to give us gifts of grace, words of love. So this story really invites us to reflect not only on our guilt, but ultimately on the incredible event that can happen in our lives just as it did in the life of Zacchaeus, whereby we are transformed, we are made new, because a relationship with Jesus is created, and we live in the joy and freedom of that. Don't you love the way Zacchaeus is a transformed man? This little man is referred to as a true son of Abraham when Jesus hears how he is changing his life and mending his ways. All by response, of course, to the primary invitation and insistent intention of Jesus to come into his house. Here was this little man, all of a sudden standing in the presence of Jesus, as tall as he could be. Something changed in his heart and in his life. If you feel that God cannot love you, take heart. He has come looking for you. If you have no voice to speak, if you stand silent in the presence of Jesus as you imagine it going that way, as it probably would, take heart, because he is the one who will speak words of grace and acceptance and forgiveness. Something happened in the heart of Zacchaeus that day, and I hope it's something that you have already experienced in your heart. It's something we need to experience regularly, the sense that God loves us, That God accepts us, not because of who we are, but because of what He has done. You might put it this way. We can all go to our tree and hide it up there and try to pretend like we're just anonymous spectators watching what's going on in the world, imagining what a relationship with God in Jesus Christ might look like, but never really having the courage to step into that. We might all just go to our tree, but remember this, Jesus went to His tree, not to hide, but to be publicly exposed there on that tree of the cross, exposed in all His shame, which really is our shame and guilt that He took to the cross, put on Him. He took all of that to His tree so that we could come out of ours and fall into the arms of Jesus, extended out to catch broken sinners like you and me, so that He can delight in us as He did in Zacchaeus, saying, "You are righteous. I have made you so. You fall short, yes, but I am here to give you a new heart and a new life and the joy of life such as you will never find or experience anywhere else." This is the hope and this is the promise of the gospel. And I hope that as you hear this message, you may hear Jesus calling your name. Jesus saying, "I must have a relationship with you. It's why I have come. Open your door. Invite me in." And you'll experience the hope and joy of what life was always intended to be. I love the way one person in a commentary on this old story has put it. The words Jesus speaks to Zacchaeus set a crown on his head that he will spend the rest of his life gladly growing tall enough to wear. I hope you know that Jesus has set a crown on your head, a crown of glory, of righteousness. It's not our righteousness that matters most in life. Thank God it doesn't. If it did, we would be helpless. We would be hopeless. But we are made righteous because of what God has done in Jesus Christ. He justifies the ungodly. He forgives the sinner. And I hope that you know the joy of that. Open your heart, the door of your life to Him. He will step in. He will change you. And you will, like Zacchaeus, according to that wonderful description that I just read to you, you will spend the rest of your life gladly growing tall enough to wear that crown of glory. Thanks so much for watching. I encourage you to share this video with others if you think it may be helpful to them. It's so encouraging to know that Jesus meets us where we are as we are, and He changes us so that we can be free of that incredible burden of sin and guilt and shame. Jesus has taken it. We shouldn't feel the weight of it anymore, but feel instead the glory of that crown set upon our heads. Thanks for watching. Be well.